Robert pressed 911 as the black family celebrated below his window, never imagining that in 20 minutes he'd be apologizing to the police chief whose wedding day he'd just destroyed. Welcome back, beautiful souls. Hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind and you won't want to miss it. Let's begin. Robert Coleman pressed his coffee mug against the window frame, the ceramic's warmth doing nothing to ease the cold knot forming in his stomach. Below, on the pristine lawn of his rental property, tables draped in ivory and gold caught the morning sun. Too many tables, he thought, counting them for the fourth time, way too many people for the agreement. At 58, Robert had learned that vigilance was the price of protecting what you'd worked for. His father had taught him that much before he died, leaving Robert these 3 rental properties and a simple truth: you give people an inch, they'll take the whole damn yard. The morning ritual of walking his properties, checking for damage, monitoring noise levels, making sure tenants respected the rules, it wasn't paranoia, it was practical. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to the rental agreement he'd forwarded to himself last week. Small family gathering for wedding reception, approximately 30 to 40 guests, ending by 10 p.m. His eyes moved back to the scene below. Cars lined both sides of the street. A DJ was setting up speakers that looked powerful enough to rattle windows 3 blocks away. The caterers alone numbered more than the promised guest count. What did I expect? The thought slipped through before he could stop it, carrying his father's voice like an unwelcome echo. 27 miles across the city. Chief Isaiah Washington stood before his bathroom mirror, adjusting his bow tie for the 7th time. His hands shook slightly, not from nerves about marriage, but from the weight of this moment. At 35, he'd never imagined he'd be getting married in uniform, but Grace had insisted. "You earned this badge," she'd said, her fingers tracing the insignia on his chest. "You wear it proud today." The morning sun streamed through their bedroom window, illuminating the pressed dress uniform hanging on the door. 15 years of service. 10 years climbing ranks that others seemed to reach in half the time. Every commendation earned twice over. Every promotion scrutinized. Every decision measured against a standard that felt impossible to define but crystal clear to fail. His phone buzzed with messages from the wedding party. Grace's last text made him smile. "Stop overthinking and get ready to marry me, Chief Washington." Chief Washington. It still felt surreal. 6 months ago, the appointment had come through after a process that felt more like a trial than an interview. But today wasn't about proving himself to anyone. Today was about Grace, about the life they were building, about the community they both loved enough to serve. He reached for his watch. His grandfather's watch, passed down through 3 generations of men who'd served their communities in different ways. His grandfather had been a postal worker back when that meant something different for a black man in the South. His father had been a teacher in Detroit's public schools. And now Isaiah wore a police chief's badge in a city that was finally ready to see past the uniform to the man underneath. At least, he hoped they were ready. Back at the window, Robert's coffee had gone cold. The celebration below was growing louder, more elaborate. A string quartet had joined the DJ. Children ran between tables, while women in bright dresses laughed with an ease that made Robert's chest tight. The Groom's family, he assumed, looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine, all sharp suits and natural confidence. Where do they get the money for all this? The question felt automatic, inherited like his father's tools and his grandfather's suspicion of anyone who seemed to have more than they should. His phone rang. Margaret from next door. "Robert, you seeing this circus? I can barely get out of my driveway with all these cars, and the music isn't even started yet." "I see it, Margaret. You going to do something? I mean, this is way beyond what they agreed to." Robert watched a group of teenagers help an elderly woman to a seat at the head table. The tenderness in the moment caught him off guard, and he almost hung up without responding. "Robert? You there?" "Yeah, I'm thinking about it." What would you do if you were in Robert's position? Have you ever had to confront your own assumptions about people? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this challenging situation. Isaiah's best man, Detective Marcus Riley, knocked on the bathroom door. "Chief, you ready? Grace is starting to get that look like she might come find you herself." Isaiah laughed, the sound echoing off the tiles. 2 minutes, Marcus. But he needed one more moment. In the mirror, he saw not just the groom, but the kid from Detroit who'd been told he was too smart for his own good, the rookie cop who'd been asked if he was sure he wanted to work this neighborhood, the sergeant who'd been passed over for promotion 3 times before anyone would admit he was the best candidate. Today, none of that mattered. Today, he was marrying Grace Elizabeth Turner, the elementary school principal who'd agreed to take his name and his badge and his complicated relationship with a job that could save the community or destroy it, depending on who was watching. The drive to the reception venue would take them through 3 neighborhoods, the one where he'd grown up, the one where he'd first walked a beat, and the one where Grace taught kids who looked like he once did how to dream bigger than their circumstances. Every street held a story, every corner a memory of why he'd chosen this work and why it had chosen him back. His radio crackled on the dresser, dispatch calling for available units to respond to a domestic disturbance 2 districts over. Isaiah reached to respond automatically, then stopped. Detective Riley's voice came through instead, handling the call. "Not today," Isaiah thought. "Today I get to just be a man getting married." He picked up his keys, straightened his uniform one final time, and headed toward the door. Grace was waiting in the sanctuary, probably tapping her foot in those elegant heels she'd bought specially for this day. Their families had traveled from 4 different states to be here. The reception venue was perfect. An old property with character, owned by someone who'd seemed eager to accommodate their celebration. Everything was exactly as they'd planned it. Robert's father had always said that trouble announced itself if you knew how to listen. As Robert watched the wedding party arrive at his property, something in his chest felt wrong, not quite fear, not quite anger, but something that demanded action. The music was getting louder. Cars were parking on his neighbor's lawn. Someone had moved his private property sign to make room for what looked like a professional photographer's backdrop. "This is exactly what I was afraid of." The thought came with such clarity that Robert felt justified reaching for his phone. Margaret was right. This was beyond what they'd agreed to. Way beyond. And if he didn't address it now, what would stop them from taking even more liberties? His fingers found 911 before he'd fully decided to call. "This is just about noise ordinances," he told himself. "Property agreements. Rules that everyone has to follow." But as Isaiah's wedding party gathered on the lawn below, laughing and embracing and celebrating with a joy that seemed to fill every corner of the property, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to cross a line he'd been walking carefully around his entire life. The phone rang once, twice. 911. "What's your emergency?" Robert watched Isaiah help his new wife out of their car, the way he moved with such careful dignity, such obvious love for the woman on his arm, and the people gathering to celebrate with them. "I'd like to report suspicious activity." 911, "What's your emergency?" Robert's palm grew damp against his phone. Through the window he could see the wedding party forming a receiving line, guests embracing the newlyweds with the kind of uninhibited joy that made his throat tighten. "I need to report suspicious activity at 1247 Maple Grove Lane. There's a large gathering here, way more people than were supposed to be here, and I'm concerned about..." He paused, watching Isaiah throw back his head in laughter at something his new father-in-law had whispered in his ear. "I'm concerned about potential criminal activity." "What type of criminal activity are you observing, sir?" Robert's eyes tracked across the scene. The caterers moved efficiently between tables. The DJ tested his microphone with a gentle 1-2 testing. Children chased bubbles while their parents sipped champagne and posed for pictures. They said it would be 30 people. "There's got to be over 100 down there. They're blocking traffic, parking on private property, making excessive noise." His voice gained momentum with each complaint. "Look, I own this property and I have a right to know what's really going on here." Below, Grace Washington smoothed her dress and looked into her new husband's eyes. The late afternoon sun caught the gold threading in her gown, making her look like she was wrapped in liquid light. Isaiah couldn't believe this woman had chosen him. Not just the badge, not just the uniform, but him. "You ready for this, Chief Washington?" she whispered, using his title like a prayer. "Ready for what? I already married you. The hard part's over." Grace laughed, the sound carrying across the lawn. "The hard part is just beginning, and you know it." The DJ's voice crackled through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the first dance between our beautiful bride and groom. Isaiah and Grace have chosen At Last by Etta James." The opening notes filled the air like honey, and Isaiah felt his chest expand with something bigger than happiness. As he led Grace to the center of the dance floor, their families and friends formed a circle around them. His partner, Detective Riley, stood next to Grace's sister, both wiping away tears they pretended not to have. "At last, my love has come along. Sir, can you describe the specific criminal activity you're witnessing?" Robert pressed closer to the window. "Well, I can't see exactly what they're doing from here, but there's definitely more going on than what they told me. The music is getting louder, and with this many people, who knows what could happen. I just think someone should check it out." "Are you reporting a noise complaint or suspicious criminal activity?" The dispatcher's voice carried a hint of impatience that made Robert's cheeks flush. Below, the bride and groom swayed together, lost in their own world. The woman's head rested on her husband's shoulder, and even from this distance, Robert could see the gentle way the man held her, like she was made of something precious. "Both," Robert said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments before. This could get out of hand. These types of gatherings, they can escalate quickly." My lonely days are over, and life is like a song." Isaiah spun Grace gently, her dress flaring around her like a flower blooming. When she came back to him, she was smiling so wide he thought his heart might stop. "What are you thinking about?" she whispered. "Your grandmother," he said softly. "How she told me that first night I came to dinner that she could tell I was good people because of how I listened when other people talked." Grace's eyes filled. She would have loved this day. She would have loved you in that dress. She would have loved seeing all our people together like this. Around them, 3 generations danced. Grace's cousins who'd driven 12 hours from Alabama, Isaiah's uncle who'd flown in from Seattle, friends from the precinct mixing with teachers from Grace's school. The string quartet joined the recorded music, adding layers of sweetness to the moment. Isaiah caught sight of Mrs. Chen from down the street, who'd brought homemade cookies despite not being officially invited. Old Mr. Peterson from the corner house was filming everything on his phone, probably to show his daughter who lived in California. The whole neighborhood had become part of their celebration. "This is what community looks like," Isaiah thought. "This is what we protect." "We'll have units in the area. Check it out," the dispatcher said. "Can I get your name and contact information?" Robert's mouth went dry. "Is that necessary? I just want someone to make sure everything's okay over there." "Standard procedure, sir." "Robert Coleman." I live at 1245 Maple Grove Lane. As he gave his phone number, Robert watched the couple finish their dance to thunderous applause. The bride threw her arms around her husband's neck, and he lifted her off the ground, spinning her once more as their families cheered. The pure joy of the moment hit Robert like a physical blow. When was the last time he'd felt that kind of happiness? When was the last time anyone had looked at him the way that woman was looking at her husband, like he hung the moon and painted the stars? What am I doing? The thought arrived just as Isaiah set Grace back down and kissed her forehead. The DJ transitioned into something more upbeat, and suddenly the dance floor filled with relatives of every age. Isaiah's teenage nephew was teaching Grace's aunt some complicated hip-hop move that had everyone laughing. Grace pulled Isaiah to the edge of the dance floor. "Look at this," she said, gesturing to their families mingling, their friends embracing, their community celebrating. "Look what we built." Isaiah followed her gaze across faces he'd known for years and faces he was meeting for the first time. His sergeant was deep in conversation with Grace's principal about school safety programs. Two of his patrol officers were helping Grace's elderly uncle to a chair, making sure he had water and shade. "We did good, didn't we?" Grace said. Before Isaiah could answer, his radio clipped to his belt, even on his wedding day, crackled to life. "All units, respond to 1247 Maple Grove Lane for a wellness check. Report of suspicious activity at a large gathering." The blood drained from Isaiah's face as he processed the address. Grace felt him stiffen. "Isaiah, what is it?" The radio crackled again. "Units 23 and 17, please respond. Complainant reports potential criminal activity." Isaiah looked around at his wedding reception, at his family, his friends, his community, and felt the familiar weight of being judged before being seen, suspected before being known. Grace's hand found his. That's us, isn't it?" In the distance, the sound of sirens began to grow louder, heading their way. Robert dropped his phone, his hands trembling as he watched patrol cars turn onto Maple Grove Lane, their red and blue lights painting the golden afternoon in harsh, violent colors. "What have I done?" The patrol cars rolled to a stop at the edge of the property like predators approaching prey. Isaiah felt every muscle in his body coil tight as Officers Martinez and Jackson stepped out, their hands resting casually on their utility belts. The music didn't stop, the DJ hadn't noticed yet, but conversations began to fade as guests turned toward the flashing lights. "This isn't happening," Isaiah whispered, more to himself than to Grace. "This is not happening on our wedding day." Grace's grip on his arm tightened. Around them, the celebration continued in pockets, children still chasing bubbles, elderly relatives still swaying to the music, but Isaiah could feel the shift in energy like a storm front moving in. Officer Martinez approached first, his young face serious but not unkind. Isaiah recognized the look, the careful neutrality every cop learned when responding to calls in neighborhoods where tension ran high. "Excuse me, sir," Martinez said, stopping just outside what he probably calculated was arm's reach. "We received a complaint about this gathering. Are you the organizer of this event?" Isaiah's throat felt like sandpaper. In his dress uniform, he commanded respect from every officer in the department. In his wedding tuxedo, standing beside his bride in their reception venue, he was just another black man being questioned by police. "This is my wedding reception," Isaiah said, his voice carefully measured. "We have permission to be here." From his window, Robert watched the interaction unfold, his stomach churning with something that might have been regret. The officers looked so young, so serious. The groom stood ramrod straight, his posture screaming military or law enforcement even in civilian clothes. "He's probably just being respectful," Robert told himself. "Good. Maybe this will all get sorted out quickly." But something in the bride's face, the way her joy had transformed into something harder, more guarded, made Robert's chest tight. She looked like someone who'd been through this before. Margaret appeared at his front door, peering around him to get a better view. "Oh, good, you called them. I was wondering when someone would finally—" "Shh," Robert cut her off, not wanting to miss what was happening below. The officers were asking for documentation now. ID, permits. The groom was reaching into his jacket pocket with deliberate, visible movements that made Robert's heart rate spike for reasons he couldn't name. "Can I see some identification, sir?" Officer Jackson requested, his tone professional but insistent. Isaiah's hands moved slowly to his inner jacket pocket, muscle memory from 15 years of training other officers on exactly this scenario. "Keep your hands visible. Move deliberately. Announce what you're doing." "I'm reaching for my wallet," Isaiah said clearly. Loud enough for the phones that had started recording around the reception area to pick up his words. Grace stepped closer to him, her wedding dress rustling like armor. "Officers, this is our wedding reception. We have a signed rental agreement. What exactly is the complaint?" Officer Martinez glanced at Jackson, then back at the couple. "Ma'am, we received a report of suspicious activity. Large gathering, potential for criminal behavior. We just need to verify everything is legitimate here." Saya felt something snap inside his chest. Suspicious activity. Criminal behavior. On his wedding day, in front of his family. In front of Grace's students' parents who'd come to celebrate. In front of his officers who were now pulling out their phones, uncertain whether to identify themselves or document everything in case they needed evidence later. "Criminal behavior," Isaiah repeated, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet reception area. "What criminal behavior exactly are you observing, officer?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, wedding guests had formed a loose circle, creating space but also bearing witness. Isaiah's uncle from Detroit stepped forward, a man who'd lived through enough police encounters to know when one was going sideways. "Easy, nephew," Uncle James said quietly. "Let them do their job." But Isaiah couldn't let it go. Not today, not here. "I want to know what criminal activity someone reported," Isaiah said, his voice gaining strength. "Because I see a wedding reception. I see families celebrating. I see children playing. I see love." His voice cracked on the last word. "So I need you to tell me what crime you think is being committed here." Officer Martinez shifted uncomfortably. He was 24, barely 3 years on the force, and nothing in his training had prepared him for this kind of tension. The complainant had been vague. Suspicious activity, too many people, potential for trouble. But looking around at the elegant reception, the well-dressed families, the obvious joy that had been interrupted by their arrival, he was starting to wonder if they'd been set up. "Sir, we're just responding to a call. If you have documentation showing you have permission to be here—" "I have permission," Isaiah said, pulling out his wallet. "I have a rental agreement. I have insurance. I have everything I need to be here celebrating my marriage." He handed over his driver's license with hands that shook slightly. "What I don't have is an explanation for why someone would call the police on a wedding." Officer Jackson studied the ID, his brow furrowing. "Isaiah Washington, that name sounds familiar." Isaiah's jaw tightened. It should. Robert pressed closer to the window, straining to hear. Something was shifting in the dynamic below. The officer's body language had changed, less aggressive, more uncertain. The groom had handed over his ID, but instead of the quick check and dismissal Robert had expected, both officers were studying it intently. "What's taking so long?" Margaret muttered behind him. Robert didn't answer. A cold dread was spreading through his chest as he watched Officer Jackson pull out his radio and step away from the group, speaking in low tones that Robert couldn't make out. The bride, Grace, he'd heard someone call her, had moved to stand directly beside her husband, her chin lifted in a way that reminded Robert of his late wife when she was preparing for a fight. The wedding guests had formed a protective semicircle around the couple, not threatening, but clearly united. This was supposed to be simple, Robert thought. A noise complaint. Check their permits, tell them to keep it down. Everyone goes home happy. Instead, he was watching a celebration transform into something that looked dangerously like a standoff. Officer Jackson returned from his radio call, his face pale. He whispered something to Martinez that made the younger officer's eyes widen. "Sir," Martinez said, his voice now carrying a different kind of respect, "we apologize for the interruption. Everything appears to be in order here." But Isaiah wasn't ready to let them walk away. Not when his family was watching, not when Grace's students' parents were filming, not when his own officers were seeing their chief being treated like a suspect at his own wedding. "That's it?" Isaiah said. "You respond to a call about criminal activity at my wedding reception. You question me and my wife. You disrupt our celebration, and now you just want to leave? I want to know who made this call and why they thought a wedding looked like criminal activity." Grace touched his arm gently. "Isaiah." "No, Grace. This isn't okay. This is exactly why nothing changes. Because we're supposed to just accept it and move on and be grateful they didn't arrest us for getting married." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of children laughing in the background, a reminder of the joy that had been stolen from this moment. Officer Martinez looked like he wanted to disappear into the pavement. "Sir, I understand you're upset." "Do you?" Isaiah's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Do you understand what it's like to have the police called on your wedding? Do you understand what it's like to be seen as suspicious for celebrating love? Have you ever been in a situation where your presence was questioned just for existing somewhere you belonged? How do you think Isaiah should handle this moment? Share your thoughts in the comments." Up in his window, Robert felt his world tilting sideways. The groom's words carried up to him with perfect clarity, each one landing like a punch to the gut. "Police called on your wedding. Seen as suspicious for celebrating love." Robert's call. Robert's assumptions. Robert's father's voice echoing in his head, telling him that trouble always looked a certain way, came from certain places, wore certain faces. He watched Isaiah's family gather closer around their son, their brother, their chief. He watched Grace's hand find her husband's, steadying him even as her own hands trembled. He watched a celebration that had looked like pure joy just minutes ago transform into something defensive and wounded. "What have I done?" The question echoed in his head as Officer Jackson made another radio call, this one longer, more urgent. Whatever was happening down there, it wasn't over. And Robert was starting to realize that his simple phone call had set something in motion that he had no idea how to stop. The weight of his father's lessons suddenly felt less like wisdom and more like chains, binding him to assumptions that had just destroyed something beautiful happening right outside his window. But admitting that would mean admitting everything else too, and Robert wasn't ready for that conversation. Not yet. Officer Jackson ended his radio call and walked back toward the group, his face a mask of professional mortification. Behind him, Martinez looked like he was calculating how quickly he could transfer to another district. "Chief Washington," Jackson said, his voice carrying across the reception area like a thunderclap. The words hit the gathering like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples of recognition through the crowd. Grace's hand flew to her mouth. Isaiah's officers straightened to attention without thinking. The wedding guests who didn't know murmured to those who did, the whispered explanations spreading through the crowd like wildfire. "Chief Washington." Isaiah closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of his badge even though he wasn't wearing it. When he opened them, Officer Jackson was extending his hand in what looked like an apology. "Sir, we had no idea. The call came in as suspicious activity, and we should have." Jackson's professionalism crumbled in real time. "Chief, I am so sorry." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the children had stopped playing, sensing the shift in the adult energy around them. The DJ had finally noticed the commotion and killed the music, leaving only the sound of traffic in the distance and someone's champagne glass being set down with excessive care. Isaiah looked at his bride, his family, his community, all watching him navigate this moment. The weight of representation pressed down on his shoulders like a physical thing. Whatever he did next would be remembered, recorded, analyzed. He was no longer just a groom having his wedding disrupted. He was the police chief responding to being profiled by his own department. "Officer Jackson," Isaiah said finally, his voice carrying the authority that came with his rank, "I want to know who made this call." Robert's knees went weak. "Chief Washington." The groom wasn't just some random citizen, he was the police chief. The man Robert had reported for suspicious activity was the head of the entire police department. "Oh my God." Margaret breathed beside him. "Robert, did you know? When you called, did you know who that was?" Robert couldn't speak. His throat had closed completely, and black spots danced at the edges of his vision. He gripped the window frame to keep from falling as the full weight of his mistake crashed over him. Chief of police. At his own wedding. That I called the police on. Through the window, he could see the officers looking increasingly uncomfortable. One of them, the younger one, kept glancing up at the surrounding houses, probably trying to figure out which one had made the call. It wouldn't take long. Robert's address was in the dispatch record. His name was in the system. They were going to come to his door. Margaret grabbed his arm. "Robert, you need to get down there. You need to explain this was just a misunderstanding. You need to—" "I need to hide," Robert whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. But even as he said it, he knew hiding wasn't an option. Not anymore. The patrol cars were parked on his street. The officers knew his name. And somewhere down on that lawn, a man was having the worst moment of what should have been the best day of his life because of a phone call Robert had made based on assumptions he was only now beginning to recognize as poison. "Chief," Officer Martinez said, his voice tight with nervousness. The call came from 1245 Maple Grove Lane, right next door. He gestured toward Robert's house. Complainant name was Robert Coleman. Isaiah followed the gesture, his eyes landing on the modest two-story house with its carefully maintained yard and drawn curtains. Somewhere behind those curtains was the person who had looked at his wedding celebration and seen a crime in progress. 1245. Isaiah repeated, the address burning itself into his memory, right next door to our reception venue. Grace moved closer to him, her presence steadying even as her voice shook with barely controlled anger. "Our neighbor called the police on our wedding." The crowd of wedding guests began to shift, subtle movements that formed a protective barrier around the bride and groom. Isaiah's Uncle James stepped forward, his Detroit street wisdom kicking in. Detective Riley moved to Isaiah's other side, his hand resting casually on his radio. Without discussing it, without planning it, the wedding party had arranged itself into something that looked dangerously like a standoff. "Isaiah," Grace said quietly, her principal voice cutting through the tension. What did he want to do? Isaiah's first instinct was pure anger. March up to that house, demand answers, make Robert Coleman explain exactly what he'd seen that looked criminal. His second instinct was professional. Handle this by the book, document everything, turn it into a teaching moment about implicit bias and police response. His third instinct was the one that scared him most. He wanted to run, to pack up his bride and his family, and leave this place where their joy had been turned into suspicion, where their love had been criminalized by someone who didn't even know their names. But Chief Washington didn't get to run. Chief Washington had to be better than his anger, more measured than his hurt, more strategic than his instincts. Chief Washington had to think about how this moment would look in the news, how it would affect police-community relations, how it would impact every officer under his command. "I want to talk to him," Isaiah said finally. "I want to understand what Robert Coleman saw that made him think my wedding was a crime scene." Officer Jackson nodded toward Robert's house. Should we go get him, Chief?" Before Isaiah could answer, Robert's front door opened. The man who emerged looked like he'd aged a decade in the past 10 minutes. His face was pale, his hands visibly shaking as he locked his door behind him. He wore the kind of clothes that suggested careful attention to respectability: pressed khakis, a polo shirt, shoes that had never seen real work. Robert Coleman looked exactly like what Isaiah had expected, and that realization made his stomach turn. Even now, even after 15 years of fighting against assumptions and stereotypes, Isaiah found himself cataloging details about this white man in this white neighborhood who had seen black joy and called it criminal activity. "Don't become what you're fighting against." Grace's voice echoed in his memory from one of their long conversations about the weight of his badge. Judge him by his actions, not his appearance. Robert walked across his perfectly manicured lawn like a man approaching his execution. The wedding guests parted slightly, creating a path but not retreating. Children pressed closer to their parents. Phones continued recording. When Robert reached the edge of the reception area, he stopped, his eyes moving from the patrol cars to the officers to the bride and groom. Up close, Isaiah could see that the man was genuinely shaken, possibly even remorseful. But remorse didn't undo the damage. Remorse didn't give them back their wedding moment. Remorse didn't erase the fact that Isaiah's family had just watched their son be treated like a criminal at his own celebration. "Mr. Coleman," Officer Jackson said, his voice tight with the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed anger. "This is Chief Washington, the man you reported for suspicious activity." Robert's eyes met Isaiah's for the first time, and the impact was immediate. Whatever Robert had expected, whatever story he'd told himself about the kind of person who would have this kind of wedding, crumbled the moment he looked into Isaiah's face. "Chief," Robert said, the word coming out like a confession. "You didn't know what?" Isaiah asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "You didn't know I was a police officer? Or you didn't know calling the police on a wedding might be wrong?" The question hung in the air between them like a blade, sharp and unavoidable. Around them, two communities faced each other, one celebrating love, one confronting hate, one fighting for joy, one drowning in assumptions. And in the center of it all, two men who had never spoken, but who were now bound together by a moment that would change both their lives forever. Robert Coleman stared at the man whose wedding he had destroyed and felt 30 years of his father's voice crumble to dust in his throat. "You can always tell," his father had said, pointing from their kitchen window at the Johnsons moving into the house across the street in 1987. "Good neighborhoods don't stay good when the wrong kind of people move in. Mark my words, Bobby, property values will drop, crime will go up, and before you know it, we'll be the ones who don't belong here." But the Johnsons had been the best neighbors they'd ever had. Mrs. Johnson had brought soup when Robert's mother was sick. Mr. Johnson had helped fix Robert's bike and never asked for anything in return. And when Robert's father died of a heart attack 3 years later, it was the Johnson family who had sat in the front row at the funeral, crying real tears for a man who had spent 3 years avoiding eye contact with them. Robert had forgotten that lesson, or buried it, or convinced himself it didn't matter. "I grew up in this house," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My father, he taught me to watch out for the neighborhood, to protect what we'd built." He looked around at the reception, at the faces staring back at him with mixtures of anger, disappointment, and pity. He said, "You could always tell when trouble was coming." Isaiah felt Grace's hand tighten on his arm, steadying him as Robert's words hit like physical blows. "What kind of trouble did you think you saw here, Mr. Coleman?" Isaiah asked, his chief's voice steady even as his husband's heart was breaking. Robert's eyes moved across the reception, the elegant tables, the string quartet packing up their instruments, the children who had stopped playing to listen to the adult conversation they didn't understand. "I don't know," Robert said, and the honesty in his voice was more devastating than any excuse would have been. I saw too many cars, too much music, too much," he gestured helplessly at the obvious joy that surrounded them. "Too much happiness, I guess. And my father's voice in my head said that meant trouble." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a fire everyone could smell, but no one could see. Grace stepped forward, her wedding dress rustling with the kind of authority that made her elementary school students sit up straight. "Mr. Coleman," she said, her voice carrying the patience of someone who had spent years teaching children how to recognize their mistakes. "What you're describing isn't about protecting your neighborhood. It's about being afraid of people who look different from you." Robert flinched as if she'd slapped him, but Grace wasn't finished. "Do you know what my husband has done for this community?" Grace continued, her voice gaining strength. "Do you know how many times he's been called to de-escalate situations exactly like this one? How many times he's had to stand between people like you and people like us and try to make peace?" Isaiah watched his wife transform their wedding reception into a classroom and felt his heart crack open with love and pride and devastating sadness. "Grace," he said softly, but she held up her hand. "No, Isaiah. He needs to understand." Grace turned back to Robert, her principal voice in full effect. "My husband became a police officer because he believed he could make things better. He believed he could be the bridge between communities that don't trust each other. And on our wedding day, the day we're celebrating our commitment to love and community and building something beautiful together, you looked at that work and called it criminal activity." Robert felt the weight of Grace's words settle in his chest like stones. Around him, the wedding guests watched with the kind of attention that suggested they were witnessing something important, something that would be talked about long after the cake was eaten and the flowers wilted. "Tell them about Linda," a voice in his head urged. "Tell them about the cancer and the isolation and how quiet the house has been since she died." But how could he explain that loneliness had made him suspicious, that grief had made him bitter, that losing the only person who had ever called him on his father's prejudices had left him drowning in assumptions he'd thought he'd outgrown? "My wife died 18 months ago," Robert said suddenly, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "Cancer, and Linda always said I needed to get to know our neighbors better. She said I spent too much time looking out windows and not enough time opening doors." Isaiah felt his anger shift, not disappearing but transforming into something more complex. "I'm sorry for your loss," Isaiah said, meaning it despite everything, "but your grief doesn't excuse what you did here." "I know," Robert said quickly. "I know it doesn't. I don't know how to be the person she wanted me to be. I don't know how to be better than what my father taught me." The honesty was brutal and raw and completely insufficient to repair the damage that had been done. Detective Riley stepped forward, his wedding guest persona dropping away to reveal the cop underneath. "Chief, what do you want us to do here? This is your call." Isaiah looked around at his wedding reception, at his family, his friends, his community, all watching him navigate this moment that would define not just his wedding day, but his leadership, his values, his commitment to the principles he'd sworn to uphold. What would Grace do? He thought, then realized he didn't need to wonder. She was standing right beside him, her hand in his, her strength flowing into him through their joined fingers. "Mr. Coleman," Isaiah said, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years in law enforcement and 35 years of being judged before being known. "Do you understand what you took from us today?" Robert's eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back since the moment he'd realized his mistake. "I took your joy. I took your peace. I took your right to celebrate without being afraid." "You took more than that," Grace said, her voice gentler now but no less firm. "You took our trust that we could exist in this neighborhood without being seen as threats. You took our children's right to see Black love celebrated without police intervention. You took our family's right to witness our happiness without fear." Isaiah watched understanding dawn in Robert's face, the full weight of his actions settling like a physical burden on the older man's shoulders. "But," Isaiah said, surprising himself with the word, "you also gave us an opportunity." Grace looked at him sharply, but Isaiah continued, "You gave us an opportunity to show our community who we really are. You gave us a chance to demonstrate that love is stronger than fear, that joy is more powerful than suspicion." Isaiah's voice grew stronger with each word. "You gave us a chance to prove that even when people see us as criminals, we can choose to see them as human beings who can learn to do better." Isaiah is choosing to see this as an opportunity rather than just an attack. What do you think about his response? How would you handle being in his position? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The silence that followed was filled with the sound of children laughing in the distance, the rustle of wedding dresses, the quiet click of phones recording a moment that none of them would ever forget. Robert Coleman stood in the center of a Black wedding reception, surrounded by people he had wronged, facing a man whose day he had destroyed, and felt something shift inside his chest. Not forgiveness, he hadn't earned that. Not absolution, that would take years of work. But possibility. The smallest, most fragile possibility that Linda's voice might be stronger than his father's after all. "What happens now?" Robert asked, his voice barely audible. Isaiah looked at Grace, then at his family, then at the community that had gathered to celebrate their love and had stayed to witness their strength. "Now," Isaiah said, "we find out if you really want to learn how to be better." The question hung in the air, like a bridge between two worlds, waiting to see who would be brave enough to cross it first. Grace Washington had spent 10 years teaching elementary school, which meant she'd developed an almost supernatural ability to recognize the exact moment when conflict could transform into learning. She saw that moment now, hovering between her husband and the man who had called police on their wedding. "Mr. Coleman," Grace said, her voice carrying the gentle authority that could calm the most disruptive classroom, "would you like to sit down?" Robert looked around at the reception area, at the elegant tables still set for celebration, at the faces watching him with cautious curiosity rather than outright hostility. The offer felt like a trap and a lifeline at the same time. I don't think that's appropriate," Robert said. "This is your day. I've already ruined enough." "You haven't ruined it," Grace said firmly. "You've complicated it, but the day isn't over, and neither is our chance to make something good come from something painful." Isaiah watched his wife work the same magic she used on scared children and defensive parents, creating space for people to be better than their worst moments. It was one of the reasons he'd fallen in love with her. Grace saw possibility where others saw problems. "What my wife is saying," Isaiah said, his chief's voice softening into something more personal, "is that we can choose how this story ends. We can let your assumptions define this day, or we can write a different ending together." Officer Martinez and Jackson exchanged glances, both recognizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. In 15 combined years of police work, neither had ever seen a situation like this transform from confrontation into conversation. "Officers," Isaiah said, noting their uncertainty, "you can go ahead and clear the call. Thank you for your professionalism." The dismissal was gentle but clear. This was no longer a police matter. As the patrol cars pulled away, the wedding reception began to tentatively resume around them. The DJ, sensing the shift in energy, started the music again at a lower volume. Children who had been pressed against their parents began to venture back toward the dance floor, but everyone remained aware of the conversation happening at the center of their celebration. Robert accepted Grace's offer of a chair, settling heavily into a seat that had been meant for Isaiah's grandfather, who hadn't been able to make the trip from Detroit. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The old white man sitting in the space reserved for the old black man, both representing different legacies, different ways of seeing the world. "Can I ask you something?" Isaiah said, pulling up a chair across from Robert. "When you looked out your window at our reception, what exactly did you see that scared you?" Robert's hands trembled as he considered the question. Around them, wedding guests continued their celebration in quiet clusters, but Isaiah could feel them listening, waiting to understand how someone could look at love and see danger. "I saw joy," Robert said finally, his voice cracking. "I saw the kind of happiness I haven't felt since Linda died, and I think that scared me more than anything else." Grace's expression softened. She pulled up a chair beside her husband, her wedding dress pooling around her like white water. "Tell us about Linda," Grace said gently. Robert's eyes filled. She was a teacher too. 4th grade. She would have loved this. He gestured at the reception, at the families mingling, at the children playing. "She always said our neighborhood needed more life in it, more celebration, more," he searched for the word, "more community." Isaiah felt something shift in his chest, anger making room for something more complex. "She sounds like she was wise," Isaiah said. "She was everything I'm not," Robert replied. "Kind without thinking about it, generous without keeping score. She saw the best in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves." He looked directly at Isaiah. "She would have been mortified by what I did today. She would have been over here with a casserole and an apology before the police cars even arrived." Grace reached across the small space between their chairs and touched Robert's hand briefly. "She sounds like someone I would have liked to know." The simple gesture broke something open in Robert's chest. When was the last time someone had touched him with kindness? When was the last time anyone had wanted to know about Linda, had acknowledged her goodness instead of just offering empty condolences? "She always said I was too much like my father," Robert continued. "Too quick to assume the worst, too slow to give people chances. She spent 32 years trying to teach me how to be better." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I guess I'm a slow learner." Isaiah leaned forward in his chair. "Can I tell you something, Mr. Coleman? Being a police officer in this community means I carry the weight of every assumption people make about me. When I put on this uniform, some people see protection and others see threat. Some see authority and others see oppression." Robert looked up, meeting Isaiah's eyes for the first time since his confession. "I became chief because I wanted to bridge that gap," Isaiah continued. "I wanted to be the kind of cop who could build trust instead of fear, who could serve everyone fairly regardless of what they looked like or where they came from." His voice carried a weight that spoke to years of fighting uphill battles. "But days like today remind me how fragile that trust is, how easily it can be shattered by assumptions." Grace watched her husband share his vulnerability with the man who had wounded them, and felt her heart expand with pride and concern in equal measure. "The burden you're describing," Robert said slowly, carrying other people's assumptions about who you are. I never thought about what that must be like. Most people don't, Isaiah replied. But Linda sounds like she did. She tried to tell me, Robert admitted. After 2020, after everything that happened, she kept saying I needed to listen more and assume less. She said fear was making me smaller than I was meant to be. Around them, the reception had found its rhythm again. Uncle James was teaching Grace's cousin a complicated card game. Detective Riley was deep in conversation with Grace's principal about community policing. The string quartet had resumed playing, their gentle melodies creating a soundtrack for healing. You know what? Grace said suddenly, standing up and smoothing her dress. I think Linda was right about your neighborhood needing more celebration. She walked over to the cake table and returned with 3 slices of their wedding cake on delicate china plates. This seems like as good a time as any to share something sweet. Robert stared at the cake, 3 layers of vanilla and strawberry with buttercream roses that looked almost too beautiful to eat. I couldn't. This is your wedding cake. Mr. Coleman, Grace said, with the kind of smile that had convinced hundreds of children to try vegetables they swore they hated. One thing you're going to learn about me is that I believe cake makes everything better, and right now I think we could all use a little sweetness. Isaiah accepted his slice with the kind of reverence he usually reserved for communion. Robert held his like it might disappear if he moved too quickly. To Linda, Grace said, raising her fork like a toast, who sounds like she knew that love is always stronger than fear. To Linda, Isaiah echoed. Robert's eyes filled again, but this time the tears felt different, cleaner, like they might actually wash something away instead of just adding to the flood. To Linda, he whispered, and took a bite of cake that tasted like forgiveness might, if forgiveness had a flavor. For a moment, the 3 of them sat in companionable silence, eating wedding cake and listening to music and watching love bloom around them in a dozen different forms. It felt fragile and precious and impossibly hopeful. But fragile things, Isaiah knew, were also the most easily broken. The Channel 7 news van turned onto Maple Grove Lane, just as Robert was taking his 3rd bite of wedding cake. The white van with its satellite dish and bold red lettering cut through the neighborhood peace like a knife through silk, and Isaiah felt every muscle in his body go rigid. "Oh no," Grace whispered, following his gaze. "Isaiah, how did they—" Her question was answered by the arrival of a 2nd van, then a 3rd, local news, followed by what looked like a freelance blogger with a phone and a press badge that probably came from a website. Robert's face went pale as he processed what was happening. The officers, one of them must have. He set down his fork with shaking hands. This is going to be on the news. Isaiah watched his wedding reception transform into a media circus in real time. Reporters began setting up cameras, their voices carrying across the lawn as they practiced their opening lines. Tonight at 11, a disturbing incident at a police chief's wedding. Questions about racial profiling right here in our community. The wedding guests began to shift nervously, parents pulling children closer, elderly relatives looking around with the kind of confusion that came from watching celebration turn into spectacle. Uncle James approached Isaiah with the look of a man who'd lived through enough history to recognize when a private moment was about to become public property. "Nephew," Uncle James said quietly, "you might want to think about how you want to handle this." But before Isaiah could respond, Detective Riley was at his side, his off-duty demeanor replaced by sharp professional concern. "Chief, we've got a problem," Riley said in low tones. "I just got a call from dispatch. This is already trending on social media. Someone filmed the officers arriving, posted it with the caption, 'Police called on Black Wedding.' It's been shared 8,000 times in the last 20 minutes. Isaiah felt the ground shift underneath him. This was no longer about his wedding day or even about Robert Coleman's assumptions. This was about his reputation, his department, his ability to lead a community that would now be watching every move he made through the lens of this moment. 8,000 shares, Isaiah repeated, the numbers echoing in his head like a death toll. Grace's hand found his arm, her touch steady even as the chaos built around them. "We can handle this," she said, but her voice carried a tremor that suggested she wasn't entirely sure. The first reporter reached them before Isaiah could form a plan. Amanda Chen from Channel 7, her camera operator already rolling, approached with the predatory smile of someone who smelled a story. "Chief Washington, Amanda Chen, Channel 7 News. Can you comment on reports that police were called to your wedding reception due to a racially motivated complaint?" The question hung in the air like a bomb with a lit fuse. Around them, wedding guests began pulling out their own phones, documenting the documentation, creating layers of recording that would dissect this moment frame by frame for months to come. Isaiah looked at the camera, then at Grace, then at Robert, who had gone completely white and was starting to stand as if preparing to flee. "This is a private celebration," Isaiah said carefully, his chief's training kicking in. "Any questions about department business should be directed to our public information officer during regular business hours." But Amanda Chen wasn't deterred. "Mr. Coleman," she said, turning toward Robert with the instinct of a hunter who'd spotted wounded prey, "you're the property owner who made the call. Can you explain what you saw that prompted you to report criminal activity?" Robert Coleman froze like a deer in headlights, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The color drained completely from his face as he realized that his name, his face, his assumptions were about to become public record. This was a misunderstanding," Robert stammered, backing away from the camera. "A misunderstanding?" Amanda pressed, following him with her microphone. "You called 911 to report criminal activity at a wedding reception. What kind of misunderstanding leads to racial profiling?" The words racial profiling landed like a slap across Robert's face. His eyes darted between the camera, the reporter, and the crowd of wedding guests who were now watching him with expressions ranging from pity to disgust. I wasn't," Robert's voice rose in panic. "You're twisting this into something it's not." Isaiah stepped forward, his protective instincts overriding his anger. "That's enough. This is private property, and you need to—" "Chief Washington," another reporter called out, "how does it feel to have your own department respond to a discriminatory call about your wedding? What does this say about police training in your jurisdiction?" The question was designed to wound, and it found its target. Isaiah felt 15 years of careful relationship building, of community trust, of proving himself worthy of the badge, crumbling in real time. "My department responded professionally to a call," Isaiah said, his voice tight with control. "The officers followed protocol that includes treating wedding receptions as potential crime scenes," the reporter pressed. Grace stepped between her husband and the cameras, her teacher instincts recognizing a classroom that had gotten completely out of control. "This interview is over," she said firmly. "This is our wedding day, and we're asking for privacy to celebrate with our families." But the damage was already being done. Isaiah could see it in the faces of his officers, could feel it in the shifting energy of the community that had come to celebrate and was now witnessing their chief become a national news story. Robert Coleman, meanwhile, was experiencing his own form of hell. The cameras had followed him as he tried to retreat toward his house, and now he found himself trapped between his front door and a growing crowd of reporters asking questions designed to expose every ugly assumption he'd made. "Mr. Coleman, do you have a history of calling police on your black neighbors? What specifically about the wedding looked criminal to you? Are you concerned about racial bias in your community?" The questions came like machine gun fire, each one designed to make him look worse, to strip away any possibility of nuance or growth or redemption. Robert felt himself shrinking under the assault, becoming smaller and more defensive with each passing second. "You don't understand," Robert said, his voice cracking under the pressure. "I made a mistake, okay? I admit that, but you're making this into something bigger than it is." "Bigger than racial profiling?" Amanda Chan asked with the kind of false innocence that made good television. "It wasn't racial profiling," Robert snapped, his fear finally exploding into anger. It was about noise and property values, and he paused, realizing how his words sounded, but the damage was already done. "Look, I have nothing against these people, but when you have that many cars, that much noise, in a neighborhood like this..." The words hung in the air like poison gas. These people, a neighborhood like this. Isaiah heard them from across the lawn and felt something break inside his chest. All the progress they'd made, all the fragile understanding they'd built over cake and conversation, shattered in an instant. Grace's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, Robert," she whispered. Robert realized what he'd said the moment the words left his mouth, but it was too late. The cameras had caught it all. The crowd had heard every damning syllable, and somewhere in that crowd, Isaiah Washington was watching the man he'd almost started to believe in reveal his true self under pressure. "These people?" Isaiah's voice cut across the chaos like a blade. "Is that what we are to you, Mr. Coleman? These people?" Robert turned toward Isaiah, his face a mask of horror at what he'd just said. "No, that's not. I didn't mean..." "You didn't mean what?" Isaiah asked, walking toward him with the kind of measured pace that made smart people step aside. "You didn't mean to show everyone exactly what you think of us? You didn't mean to prove that your apology was just performance?" "Isaiah, please," Robert said, reaching out desperately. "You know that's not what I meant. We were talking, we were connecting." "We were what?" Isaiah's voice rose for the first time all day, months of careful control finally cracking under the weight of disappointment. "You think eating cake erases what you did? You think crying about your dead wife makes it okay that you criminalized my wedding?" The words hit Robert like physical blows, each one designed to wound. Around them, cameras rolled and phones recorded, and the fragile bridge they'd built between their two worlds collapsed into dust. "I tried," Robert said, his voice barely a whisper. "I tried to be better." "No," Isaiah said, his chief's authority mixing with a husband's heartbreak. "You tried to make yourself feel better. There's a difference." Grace watched her husband's face close off, watched him rebuild the walls that their conversation had started to tear down. She saw Robert Coleman collapse into himself, becoming exactly the small, frightened man that fear and prejudice had always made him. And she realized that some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt in a day. The cameras kept rolling, the questions kept coming, and somewhere in the middle of it all, two men who had almost found their way to understanding each other stood on opposite sides of a chasm that felt wider than it had ever been. 3 hours later, Isaiah Washington sat alone in his hotel room, still wearing his wedding tuxedo, staring at his phone as notifications continued to explode across the screen. Police chief wedding was trending nationally. The video of Robert Coleman saying these people had been viewed 2.3 million times. His department's main line had been flooded with calls from reporters, activists, and citizens demanding statements, explanations. Grace was in the bathroom, finally out of her wedding dress, washing off makeup that had been ruined by tears she'd refused to shed in front of the cameras. They hadn't spoken since leaving the reception, both processing the wreckage of what should have been the happiest day of their lives. Isaiah's reflection stared back at him from the black screen of his phone. Chief Washington. The title felt heavier tonight than it ever had before. Tomorrow he would have to face his department, his community, the media, and somehow find a way to lead through this crisis that had become as much about his character as his capability. "I tried to be better than my anger," he thought. I tried to show grace under pressure, and look where it got me." His phone buzzed with a text from Detective Riley. "Chief, I'm sorry about how this went down. For what it's worth, everyone who was there saw how you handled it. Your officers respect you more now, not less." Another text, this one from his Uncle James. "Proud of you, nephew. Your grandmother would have been proud too. Love ain't always pretty, but it's always worth fighting for." And then, buried between messages from reporters and statements from city officials, Isaiah saw a notification that made his blood run cold. A text from an unknown number. "Chief Washington, this is Robert Coleman. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need you to know something. Please." Isaiah stared at the message for a long time, his thumb hovering over the delete button. 4 blocks away, Robert Coleman sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by the debris of the worst day of his life. His laptop screen showed a news article with his photo, a screenshot from the video, capturing him mid-sentence as he said the words that had destroyed any possibility of redemption. The headline read, "Racist Neighbor Calls Police on Black Police Chief's Wedding." Racist. The words stared back at him from dozens of articles, comment threads, social media posts. Is that what he was? Is that what Linda would see if she could look at him now? The house felt cavernous around him, filled with 30 years of memories with a woman who had spent their entire marriage trying to make him better than his father's son. Her voice echoed in every room, gentle corrections and patient questions designed to open his mind rather than change it by force. "Bobby," she'd said, after he'd complained about the music coming from the Martinez family's quinceañera 3 summers ago, "when did celebration become something to fear instead of something to join?" He'd dismissed her then, muttered something about property values and noise ordinances. But now, sitting alone with the weight of what he'd done, he could hear the sadness in her voice. The disappointment she'd tried so hard to hide. Robert picked up his phone and read the text he'd sent to Isaiah Washington's number, a number he'd found through the city directory after 40 minutes of searching. The message had been marked as read 20 minutes ago, but no response had come. What did you expect? He asked himself. That saying please would fix everything? But Linda's voice whispered back, the hardest part about being wrong isn't admitting it, it's doing the work to be right. Robert looked around his empty house, at the drawn curtains that had kept him separate from his community for 18 months, at the windows he'd used to spy instead of connect. If he was going to do the work Linda had always asked of him, he couldn't do it from behind glass. The hotel room. Grace emerged from the bathroom, in her pajamas, her face clean of makeup, but marked by exhaustion that went deeper than skin. She found Isaiah still staring at his phone, still wearing his tuxedo like armor he couldn't bring himself to remove. "What are you looking at?" she asked gently, settling beside him on the bed. Isaiah showed her Robert's text. Grace read it twice, her expression unreadable. "What do you think he wants to say?" she asked. "I don't know, and I'm not sure I care anymore." Isaiah's voice carried a weariness that had nothing to do with the late hour. "I gave him a chance, Grace. I ate cake with him. I shared my story. I tried to build a bridge, and he burned it down the moment the cameras started rolling." Grace was quiet for a long moment, her teacher's mind working through the complexities of human behavior, the difference between failing and giving up. "You know what I see in my classroom sometimes?" she said finally. "Kids who've been hurt, who've learned to protect themselves by hurting others first. And the hardest lesson I've had to learn is that sometimes people get worse before they get better. Sometimes the fear of change makes them grab onto their old ways even tighter." Isaiah looked at his wife. This woman who had chosen to marry a police chief in 2025, who had committed herself to the complicated work of loving someone whose job required him to stand between communities that didn't trust each other. "Are you saying I should respond to him?" "I'm saying," Grace said carefully, "that you get to choose who you want to be in this moment. Not who the media wants you to be, not who the community expects you to be, but who you want to be when you wake up tomorrow and look at yourself in the mirror." Isaiah felt the weight of that choice settle in his chest. He could delete Robert's message and move on, focus on damage control and reputation management. He could respond with anger, make it clear that Robert Coleman had burned his bridges beyond repair. Or he could— What would Linda do? Isaiah asked suddenly. Grace smiled sadly. "I think Linda would say that love is a choice you make every day, especially when it's hard." Robert's kitchen. The clock on Robert's microwave read 11:47 p.m. when his phone finally buzzed with a response. "Mr. Coleman, this is Chief Washington. You have 5 minutes to say whatever you think I need to know. After that, I'm blocking this number and moving on with my life." Robert stared at the message, his hands shaking as he tried to figure out how to compress a lifetime of regret into 5 minutes of text. How do you apologize for 30 years of inherited prejudice? How do you explain that your worst self isn't your only self? His fingers moved across the keyboard. "Chief Washington, I won't insult you by asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that Linda saw this moment coming years before it happened. She told me that someday I'd have to choose between the man my father raised me to be and the man she believed I could become. Today I chose wrong. I chose fear over love, assumptions over truth. I chose to be my father's son instead of Linda's husband. I know it's too late to fix today. But if you'll let me, I want to spend whatever time I have left becoming the man she always saw in me. Not for you, not for the cameras, but because loving her means becoming worthy of that love. I start tomorrow by going to every door on this street and apologizing for making our neighborhood feel unsafe for families like yours. I know it won't fix what I broke, but it's the only work that matters now." Robert hit send before he could second-guess himself, then set the phone down and waited. The hotel room. Isaiah read Robert's message twice, then handed the phone to Grace. She read it in silence, her expression moving through surprise, skepticism, and something that might have been hope. "What do you think?" Isaiah asked. "I think," Grace said slowly, "that he's finally telling the truth. The question is, what are you going to do with that truth?" Isaiah looked out the hotel window at the city he'd sworn to serve and protect, at the community that was watching to see how their chief would handle being wounded by the very prejudice he'd spent his career fighting. He could choose bitterness. He could choose to let Robert Coleman's assumptions define not just this day, but his approach to every future interaction with people who looked like Robert, lived like Robert, carried the same inherited fears. Or he could choose something harder. Isaiah picked up his phone and began to type, "Mr. Coleman, I don't know if people can really change. But Linda sounds like she believed they could. If you're serious about doing the work, then do it. Not for me, not for the cameras, but because that's what love requires. And if you are doing the work, really doing it, then maybe we can have a different conversation in 6 months. Maybe." He hit send and immediately turned off his phone. Grace curled against him in the hotel bed, her hand finding his in the darkness. "Think he'll actually do it?" she asked. "I don't know," Isaiah said honestly. "But I know who I want to be if he does." Outside their window, the city slept on, unaware that in 2 different places, 2 men were lying awake making the hardest choice of their lives, the choice to become better than they'd ever been before. 6 months later. The community center on Maple Grove Street buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that preceded either disaster or miracle. Isaiah Washington stood at the back of the room, watching neighbors file in for what the flyers had called a community conversation about building bridges, an event that Robert Coleman had organized, funded, and personally invited every resident within a 3-block radius to attend. Grace squeezed Isaiah's hand as they watched Robert set up folding chairs with the help of Mrs. Chen, who had become his unlikely mentor over the past months. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Robert moved with less stiffness, made eye contact more readily, and seemed to take up space in the world differently than he had that devastating wedding day. "Think he'll actually go through with it?" Grace whispered. "He's made it this far," Isaiah replied, though his voice carried the caution of a man who'd learned not to trust too quickly. The past 6 months had been a journey neither man could have imagined. Robert had kept his word about going door to door, but it had taken him 3 weeks to work up the courage to actually knock on the first one. Mrs. Martinez had slammed the door in his face. The Johnsons had listened politely but coldly. Mr. Peterson from the corner house had suggested that Robert might want to consider moving somewhere his views would be more welcome. But Mrs. Chen had invited him in for tea. That first conversation had lasted 4 hours. Robert had tried to explain, to justify, to minimize. Mrs. Chen had listened with the patience of someone who understood that shame made people defensive, and that defensive people rarely learned anything useful. "You want to be better?" she'd asked finally, refilling his cup. "Then stop talking and start listening. And stop trying to make yourself feel better and start trying to make others feel safer." Mrs. Chen had become Robert's guide into a world he'd lived beside but never entered. She'd introduced him to the Martinez family, who'd told him about their daughter's fear of calling 911 during a break-in because she was afraid the police would question their right to be in their own home. She'd connected him with the Johnsons, who'd shared stories about being followed in stores, questioned in their own neighborhood, assumed to be criminals until proven innocent. Each conversation had stripped away another layer of Robert's assumptions, revealing the complex reality of living while black in a community that claimed to be colorblind. The hardest conversation had come 3 months in, when Robert had finally worked up the courage to visit the elementary school where Grace taught. He'd sat in her classroom after hours, surrounded by artwork celebrating Black History Month, and tried to explain what he was learning about himself. "The thing is," Robert had said, his voice shaking, "I always thought I wasn't racist because I didn't use slurs or burn crosses. I thought as long as I wasn't actively hurting people, I was one of the good ones." Grace had listened with the same patience she gave to students struggling with difficult concepts. "But what I'm learning," Robert continued, "is that there's a difference between not being actively harmful and being actively helpful. There's a difference between not being racist and being anti-racist." Grace had nodded. "What's the difference, Mr. Coleman?" "Anti-racist means doing the work even when it's uncomfortable. It means using my privilege to make things better instead of just maintaining things as they are." Robert had looked around at the classroom, at the posters celebrating diversity and the books that centered stories of all kinds of children. "It means being the kind of neighbor Linda always wanted me to be, even when Linda isn't here to remind me." That conversation had led to Robert volunteering to read to Grace's students during Literacy Week, which had led to him organizing a neighborhood watch program focused on community building rather than suspicious reporting, which had led to tonight. "Good evening, everyone," Robert said, his voice carrying across the packed community center. "Thank you all for coming. I know many of you are here because you're curious about what the man who called police on the Washington's wedding could possibly have to say 6 months later." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the crowd. Isaiah felt Grace's hand tighten in his. "I could stand up here and tell you about all the learning I've done, all the books I've read, all the conversations I've had," Robert continued. "But that would be making this about me, and what I've learned is that this was never about me." Robert gestured toward Isaiah and Grace, who hadn't planned to be acknowledged but found themselves in the spotlight anyway. 6 months ago, I looked at love and saw danger. I looked at joy and saw threat. I looked at community and saw chaos. Robert's voice grew stronger with each admission. "I didn't just call the police on a wedding. I called the police on the radical idea that this neighborhood could be a place where everyone belongs." The room had gone completely quiet, the kind of silence that preceded either applause or exodus. "But here's what I want you to know," Robert said, turning to face Isaiah directly. "Chief Washington could have destroyed me that day. He could have used his position, his platform, his righteous anger to make sure I faced every consequence of my actions. Instead, he chose to see if I was capable of growth." Isaiah felt his chest tighten as Robert continued. "That choice, to leave the door open for redemption instead of slamming it shut on judgment, that choice saved my life. Not because it kept me from consequences, but because it kept me from giving up on the possibility that I could be better." Robert reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Mrs. Chen helped me understand that apologies without action are just performance. So instead of apologizing again, I want to share what we've built together over these past 6 months." He unfolded the paper, revealing a detailed plan for community initiatives, monthly neighborhood dinners, a community garden, youth mentorship programs, and a restorative justice circle for addressing conflicts before they escalated to police involvement. These programs exist because Chief Washington chose grace over vengeance, because Mrs. Chen chose teaching over rejection, because this community chose growth over comfort. Robert looked around the room at faces that had moved from skepticism to cautious hope. And because Linda Coleman, who died before she could see her husband become the man she always believed he could be, taught me that love requires action. The silence that followed was different now, pregnant with possibility rather than tension. Grace stood up, her movement causing a rustle of attention through the crowd. "Mr. Coleman," she said, her teacher's voice carrying easily through the room, "you asked me once what Linda would think of the work you've been doing." Robert nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I think Linda would say that love isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. It's about showing up, day after day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, and choosing to be better than you were yesterday." Grace looked at her husband, then back at Robert. "I think Linda would be proud of the man you're becoming. And I think she'd want you to know that the work isn't finished, but it's begun." What does redemption look like to you? Do you believe people can truly change, or is some damage irreparable? Share your thoughts on second chances and the hard work of becoming better in the comments below. Isaiah stood slowly, feeling the weight of 6 months of watching, waiting, and carefully guarded hope. "Mr. Coleman," Isaiah said, his chief's voice filling the room, "6 months ago you took something from my family. You took our joy, our peace, our right to celebrate without fear." The room held its breath. "But tonight," Isaiah continued, walking toward the front of the room, "you're giving something back, not just to us, but to this entire community. You're giving us a model for how to repair harm, how to transform hurt into healing, how to turn our worst moments into opportunities for our best selves." Isaiah stopped in front of Robert, extending his hand. "Linda sounds like she was a wise woman. I wish I could have known her." Isaiah's voice softened, "But I'm grateful that her love made you brave enough to do this work." Robert took Isaiah's hand, and the room erupted in applause that sounded like relief, like hope, like the sound of barriers falling down. Grace watched her husband choose grace over guardedness, watched Robert choose growth over defensiveness, and felt her heart expand with the kind of love that multiplied when it was shared. Later, as neighbors mingled over coffee and cake, because Grace insisted that important conversations required dessert, Isaiah found himself standing beside Robert at the edge of the community center, watching Mrs. Chen teach a group of children a complicated clapping game. "You know what the hardest part has been?" Robert said quietly. "What's that?" Learning that Linda was right about everything, but I had to nearly lose my humanity to figure that out. Robert's voice carried the weight of 6 months of difficult realizations. She always said this neighborhood needed more celebration, more connection, more joy. She would have loved your wedding. Isaiah felt something settle in his chest, a kind of peace he hadn't realized he'd been missing. She would have loved Grace, Isaiah said. They both understand that love is work that never ends. Robert nodded, watching the children play. Think this will stick? The changes we're making. Isaiah considered the question, looking around at neighbors who were actually talking to each other, at children playing together across lines that had once seemed insurmountable, at a community that was choosing connection over suspicion. I think Linda and Grace would say that love is always at risk, Isaiah said finally, but it's also always worth fighting for. As if summoned by their conversation, Grace appeared beside them, carrying 3 cups of coffee and wearing the smile that had convinced Isaiah to believe in forever. "What are you two plotting over here?" she asked, handing them each a cup. "The future," Robert said simply. Grace raised her coffee cup in a toast. "To Linda, who knew that love is stronger than fear." "To Linda," Isaiah echoed. "And to the work that never ends." "To Linda," Robert whispered, "and to second chances that become new beginnings." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their community celebrate not the absence of conflict, but the presence of commitment to growth, to healing, to the radical idea that people could choose to love each other across the lines that had once divided them. Outside, the late spring evening was painting Maple Grove Lane in golden light, and somewhere in that light, the echo of a woman's laughter seemed to whisper that this choice to keep becoming better was exactly what love looked like when it finally truly came to last.
This story explores how love in all its forms requires us to choose growth over comfort, understanding over assumption, and grace over grievance, even when that choice costs us everything we thought we knew about ourselves and our world. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Thank you for watching this story to the end.